It is December 23rd, 1783. A tall man stands alone in a grand chamber in Annapolis, Maryland. Outside, snow falls gently on a young nation still catching its breath after 8 brutal years of war. Inside the Maryland State House, members of the Continental Congress wait in tense silence. The man is 51 years old. His face is weathered, his body worn from years of military campaigns. He has just led a ragtag army to impossible victory against the greatest military power on earth. He commands the loyalty of tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. With one word, he could make himself king. With one gesture, he could seize absolute power. Instead, he reaches into his coat and pulls out a single piece of paper. His hands tremble slightly as he begins to read. His voice cracks with emotion. He removes his spectacles, a recent necessity he is still embarrassed about, and apologizes to the gathered delegates. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles. For I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Grown men weep openly. What he does next will shock the world. It will set a precedent that will echo through centuries. It will define the character of the nation he helped create. George Washington is about to resign. He is giving up power voluntarily. He is going home. King George III of England, when he hears this news, will say in astonishment, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. But who was this man, really? How does a boy born into modest Virginia gentry become the commander of a revolutionary army? How does a man with limited formal education know real political philosophy and a fierce temper become known as the embodiment of Republican virtue? How does someone who lost more battles than he won become celebrated as one of history's greatest generals? This is not a story of perfection. This is not a tale of a marble statue come to life. This is the story of a real man, flawed, ambitious, sometimes insecure, occasionally petty, who somehow rose to meet every impossible moment history threw at him. This is the story of a man who enslaved other human beings while fighting for freedom, who craved fame but constantly sacrificed personal glory, who had no children of his own but became father to a nation. This is the story of George Washington, the man who could have been king, but chose to be a citizen instead, and it begins not with glory, but with lost-up modest farmhouse on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. A baby boy entered the world. The day would later become one of the most celebrated in American history. But on that cold February morning, there was nothing to suggest this child was destined for greatness. He was the first son of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. They named him George. The Virginia into which George Washington was born was not yet America. It was a colony, a distant outpost of the British Empire, clinging to the edge of a vast and mysterious continent. To the east lay the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Virginia to England and the wider world. To the west lay endless forests, mountain ranges, and territories occupied by Native American nations who had lived there for thousands of years. The Washington family was neither poor nor aristocratic. They belonged to Virginia's middling sort, landowners with modest estates, some slaves, and aspiration of climbing higher on the social ladder. Augustine Washington, George's father, was an ambitious man. He owned several tobacco plantations and had invested in iron mining operations. He was always looking for the next opportunity, the next venture that might secure his family's fortune. George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a different sort of person entirely. She had been orphaned young and left with little inheritance. Her marriage to Augustine was her security, but it did not make her soft or sentimental. Mary Washington was tough, independent, and demanding. She managed the household with an iron will and expected obedience from her children. George was not Mary's first child. He had an older half-brother, Lawrence, from his father's first marriage, but he was her firstborn son, and she watched over him with fierce protectiveness that would, over time, shade into something closer to possessiveness. The Washington household was busy and crowded. George had several siblings: Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, and Charles. The house on Pope's Creek was comfortable, but not grand. The family later moved to a larger property on the Rappahannock River, across from the small port town of Fredericksburg. Life in colonial Virginia revolved around agriculture and the rhythms of the seasons. Tobacco was the cash crop, the source of whatever wealth a Virginia planter might accumulate. The work was done by enslaved Africans and African Americans, whose forced labor made plantation life possible. George grew up surrounded by slavery. It was simply part of the world he knew. The moral horror of it, the fundamental injustice, would not become clear to him until much later in life, and even then, his actions to address it would be halting and incomplete. But as a boy, he accepted it as normal, just as he accepted the forests and the rivers and the changing seasons. What kind of child was George Washington? He was big for his age, strong, physical, and athletic. He loved the outdoors. He rode horses with natural skill. He explored the woods and fields around his home. He was not particularly scholarly. Books did not fascinate him the way they did some children. But he was curious, observant, and practical. He was also sensitive. He craved approval. He wanted to be admired, to be thought well of. This desire for respect, for honor, would drive him his entire life. It would make him capable of incredible self-discipline. It would also make him vulnerable to slights, real or imagined. George attended a small local school, where he learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. His handwriting was careful and precise. He loved copying things out: lists, rules, maxims. When he was about 14, he painstakingly transcribed a document called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, a list of 110 guidelines for proper conduct. Rule Number 1. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Rule number 44. When a man does all he can though it succeeds not, well, blame not him that did it. These rules were not just exercises. George took them to heart. He internalized them. Throughout his life, he would struggle to control his temper, to master his emotions, to present himself with dignity. The rules gave him a framework. They gave him armor, but the secure world of George's childhood was about to shatter. In April 1743, when George was 11 years old, his father died suddenly. Augustine Washington had been out inspecting his properties in a rainstorm. He came home soaked and chilled. Within days, he was dead, likely from pneumonia or some other respiratory infection. Medical care in colonial Virginia was rudimentary at best. Once he fell ill, there was little that could be done. For George, this loss was catastrophic. His father had been the center of the family, the provider, the planner. Augustine had dreamed of sending his sons to England for education, just as he had sent Lawrence, George's older half-brother. Now those dreams evaporated. There was not enough money. The estate had to be divided among the widow and all the children. George's inheritance was meager: a few slaves, a small farm that would not come into his possession until he came of age. His future, which had seemed comfortably secure, was now uncertain. Mary Ball Washington, now a widow with 5 young children, held the family together through sheer force of will. But she was anxious, protective to the point of smothering. She would never remarry. She would spend the rest of her long life worrying about money, complaining about neglect, and demanding attention from her children, especially from George. George's relationship with his mother was complicated. He respected her, supported her financially throughout her life, but he did not seem to love her warmly. She was difficult, demanding, never satisfied. Years later, when George was commander-in-chief and then president, Mary Washington would publicly complain that her son neglected her, that she was left in poverty, claims that were not true, but which embarrassed Washington deeply. But in 1743, George was just a bereaved 11-year-old boy, trying to figure out what came next. In the absence of his father, George turned to Lawrence Washington. Lawrence was 14 years older than George, a young man already established in the world. He had been educated in England. He had served as an officer in the British Army during a colonial war in the Caribbean. He had returned to Virginia a gentleman, polished and sophisticated. Everything George aspired to be, Lawrence had inherited the family's finest estate. A beautiful property on the Potomac River, he renamed it Mount Vernon, after Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom he had served. Lawrence married in Fairfax, a young woman from one of Virginia's most powerful and aristocratic families. Suddenly, through his brother, George had access to a world of wealth and influence he had never known. Mount Vernon became George's second home. He visited constantly. He idolized Lawrence. He watched how his brother walked, talked, entertained guests. He learned the manners of Virginia's gentry class. He met the Fairfax family, enormously wealthy, connected to the British aristocracy. Owners of vast tracts of land, George Lord Fairfax, Lawrence's brother-in-law, took a liking to young George. He saw potential in the boy, the physical strength, the eagerness to learn, the discipline. Through these connections, George's path forward began to take shape. He would not be a scholar. He would not go to England. But he could become a surveyor, a profession that required practical mathematics, offered decent pay, and provided an excuse to explore the Virginia frontier. At 16, George Washington set out into the wilderness with a surveying party. He kept a journal of the expedition. The writing is straightforward, unpolished, but it captures his excitement. He describes sleeping under the stars, encountering Native Americans, swimming horses across swollen rivers, enduring rain and cold. He is testing himself, proving himself, beginning to build the persona that will define him. But even as George's future begins to open up, another shadow falls. Lawrence, his beloved brother, his mentor, falls ill. Lawrence's declinant illness came on slowly at first. Lawrence Washington began to cough. He lost weight. He tired easily. The doctors called it consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis, a bacterial infection of the lungs that was often fatal in the 18th century. George watched his brother decline with helpless anguish. Lawrence tried everything. He traveled to the medicinal springs in western Virginia, hoping the waters might cure him. They did not. In desperation, he decided to try the warm climate of the Caribbean. Believing the tropical air might restore his health, he asked George to accompany him. In September 1751, the two brothers sailed for Barbados, a British sugar colony in the West Indies. It was the only time in his life that George Washington would leave the North American continent. The voyage took 37 days. George kept a detailed journal. He describes the endless ocean, the flying fish, the dolphins, the wonder of seeing a new world. When they arrived in Barbados, he was dazzled by the lush vegetation, the exotic fruits, the elegant colonial society. But the trip was a disaster. Lawrence's health did not improve. Worse, George contracted smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases of the era. He was sick for weeks, burning with fever, his face erupting in the characteristic pustules. He survived, but his face would carry the scars for the rest of his life. The smallpox did, however, grant him immunity, a piece of luck that would prove significant later. During the Revolutionary War, when smallpox ravaged the Continental Army, Lawrence, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. After a few months, he decided to send George home while he traveled on to Bermuda. Still searching for a climate that might save him, George returned to Virginia alone. In July 1752, Lawrence came home to Mount Vernon. He was skeletal, weak, coughing blood. On July 26, 1752, with his wife and brother at his bedside, Lawrence Washington died. He was 34 years old. George was devastated. He had lost his father at 11. Now, at 20, he lost the brother who had taken his father's place. Lawrence's death, however, opened doors for George. Lawrence left Mount Vernon to his infant daughter, but with the provision that if she died, the estate would pass to George. Tragically, the little girl died within 2 years. By 1754, George Washington became the master of Mount Vernon, one of the finest estates in Virginia. But George had Ambitions beyond farming, Lawrence had held a position in the Virginia militia, prestigious appointment that came with a title, a uniform, and the respect of his peers. George wanted that same recognition. He wanted to be an officer, a gentleman, a man of consequence. He lobbied the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, for a position. He had some surveying experience. He was strong and capable. He had connections through the Fairfax family. In October 1753, Governor Dinwiddie gave 21-year-old George Washington his first real opportunity. The British and French empires were on the brink of war over control of the Ohio River Valley, a vast, rich territory that both sides claimed. The French had begun building a series of forts in the region, threatening British interests. Dinwiddie needed someone to deliver a message to the French commander, warning him to withdraw. It was a dangerous mission. The journey would cover hundreds of miles through wilderness in winter, through territories controlled by Native American nations who might be hostile. Many men would have refused. George Washington volunteered immediately. In November 1753, Washington set out with a small party that included an experienced frontiersman and translator named Christopher Gist, as well as several other companions. The journey was brutal. They traveled on horseback and on foot through dense forests, across icy rivers, over mountains. Snow fell, temperatures dropped. Washington's journal entries describe the hardship in matter-of-fact language. But the reality was harrowing. They reached a French fort at Venango in present-day Pennsylvania. Washington delivered his message to the French commander, who was polite but firm. France had no intention of withdrawing on the return journey. Things got worse. Washington and Gist were ambushed by a Native American warrior who shot at them from close range. The bullet missed. They escaped into the forest, traveling all night to put distance between themselves and possible pursuit later. They tried to cross the ice-choked Allegheny River on a makeshift raft. The raft overturned. Washington was thrown into the freezing water. He nearly drowned. He and Gist spent the night on an island, soaked and freezing. But before finally crossing the next morning, when the river had frozen more solidly, Washington returned to Williamsburg, Virginia's capital. In January 1754, he had completed his mission. He delivered his report to Governor Dinwiddie, who was impressed enough to have it published. Suddenly, George Washington was a minor celebrity, a brave young officer who had ventured into hostile territory and returned with vital intelligence. Washington had tasted adventure and recognition. He wanted more. In the spring of 1754, tensions in the Ohio Valley escalated. Governor Dinwiddie decided to send a military expedition to establish a British fort at the strategic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the site where Pittsburgh stands today. Washington, now a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, was given command of a small force tasked with supporting the expedition. He marched west with about 160 men. The going was slow. They had to cut roads through the forest, haul supplies over rough terrain. Washington was inexperienced, impulsive, eager to prove himself. In late May, Washington received intelligence from his Native American ally, Tonagrisson, also called the Half-King, that a French scouting party was camped nearby. Washington decided to attack. At dawn on May 28, 1754, Washington and his men, along with Tonagrisson's warriors, surprised the French camp. The fight was over in 15 minutes. 10 Frenchmen were killed, including their commander, Joseph Callan de Jumonville. 21 were taken prisoner. Washington believed he had struck a blow against the enemy, but the French insisted that Jumonville's party had been on a diplomatic mission, essentially doing exactly what Washington himself had done the previous year. The French accused Washington of murdering an ambassador. Whether the attack was justified or a tragic mistake remains debated by historians. What is certain is that this small skirmish in the Pennsylvania wilderness set off a chain of events that led to the French and Indian War in North America, which became part of the global 7 Years' War, a conflict that engulfed Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. George Washington age 22, had inadvertently started a world war, Washington knew the French would retaliate. He and his men hastily constructed a crude fortification in a meadow clearing called Great Meadows. He named it Fort Necessity. It was a terrible location surrounded by wooded hills that gave attackers cover, sitting in low ground that would turn to mud in the rain. Washington's inexperience showed. On July 3, 1754, a force of about 600 French soldiers and their Native American allies attacked. It rained throughout the battle, turning Fort Necessity into a muddy, miserable trap. Washington's men huddled behind their flimsy wooden palisade. Taking fire from enemies they could barely see by evening, Washington had lost a third of his men. His position was hopeless. The French commander offered terms. Washington and his men could leave with their weapons and colors if they signed a document acknowledging responsibility for Jumonville's death. Washington, exhausted and desperate, signed. He later claimed he did not fully understand the French document. Whether that is true or a convenient excuse, the result was the same: he surrendered. It was the only time in his military career that George Washington surrendered to an enemy. The young officer returned to Virginia humiliated. He resigned his commission, bitter and embarrassed. His first major military command had ended in defeat and controversy, but Washington did not give up. He would get another chance. And the lessons he learned from failure about patience, about logistics, about controlling his impulsiveness, would eventually make him one of history's most effective commanders. For now, though, he retreated to Mount Vernon to lick his wounds and reconsider his future. In 1755, the British government decided to take the conflict with France seriously. They sent professional soldiers, redcoats, from the regular British Army to North America, under the command of Major General Edward Braddock. A veteran officer with decades of experience, Braddock's mission was to capture Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the confluence of the rivers. That Washington had failed to secure the previous year, despite his recent defeat, was eager to redeem himself. He wrote to Braddock offering his services. Braddock, who needed officers familiar with the American wilderness, invited Washington to join his staff as a volunteer aide-d-camp. Washington accepted immediately. He would serve without official rank, without pay, simply for the honor and the experience. This desire to serve, to be part of great events, was pure Washington. His ambition and his idealism intertwined. In the spring of 1755, Braddock's expedition set out from Fort Cumberland in Maryland. The army numbered about 2,200 men, including British regulars and colonial militia. They marched west, cutting a road through the forest, hauling heavy artillery and supply wagons. Washington admired Braddock's professionalism, but he also saw the general's weaknesses. Braddock was arrogant. He dismissed advice from colonial officers. He had contempt for Native American allies. He believed European-style linear warfare soldiers in tight formations. Firing in disciplined volleys would carry the day against any enemy. Washington tried to warn him that fighting in the American wilderness required different tactics. Braddock ignored him. The army was just a few miles from Fort Duquesne when disaster struck. As the British column crossed the Monongahela River and marched through dense forest, they were ambushed by a combined force of French soldiers and Native American warriors. The attackers used the trees as cover, firing from concealment. The British, trained to fight in open fields, stood in formation and tried to return volleys at an enemy they could barely see. It was a massacre. Soldiers fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. Officers were targeted first. The attackers recognized them by their uniforms and horses. Braddock himself was shot through the chest. The army disintegrated into panic. George Washington was in the thick of it. He rode back and forth across the battlefield, trying to rally the troops, delivering orders. The horses were shot out from under him, for bullets tore through his coat. One pierced his hat. By any rational calculation, he should have been killed, but he emerged unscathed. Years later, a Native American chief who fought in the battle claimed he had personally shot at Washington multiple times. Convinced that the young officer was protected by the Great Spirit, Washington helped organize the retreat, riding alongside the mortally wounded Braddock, who died 4 days later. Of the 1,300 British and colonial soldiers who entered the battle, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. It was one of the worst defeats the British Army ever suffered. But out of catastrophe came opportunity for Washington. He was celebrated as a hero, the brave young Virginian who had kept his head, while professional British officers panicked. Colonial newspapers praised his courage. His reputation soared, and he learned a crucial lesson: courage and determination could matter more than formal training. Flexibility could trump rigid doctrine. These insights would serve him well 20 years later, when he faced the British Army again, this time as an enemy. In August 1755, the Virginia legislature created the Virginia Regiment, a full-time military force to defend the colony's frontier. They needed a commander. George Washington, now 23 years old, was the obvious choice. He was given the rank of colonel and command of about 1,000 men. It was a significant responsibility, but it came with immense frustration. The Virginia frontier was under constant attack. French-allied Native American raiding parties struck isolated settlements, killing colonists, taking captives, burning farms. Washington's job was to defend a 300-mile frontier with inadequate men, inadequate supplies, and inadequate support from the colonial government. He established a chain of small forts. He drilled his soldiers. He struggled with desertion, with incompetent subordinates, with politicians who made promises they did not keep. He wrote letter after letter to the Virginia legislature, begging for reinforcements, for equipment, for money. His letters from this period reveal his growing bitterness. He felt disrespected. He commanded a colonial regiment, but he had no official rank in the British Army, which meant any British officer, even a junior lieutenant, technically outranked him. It galled him. He petitioned for a royal commission. He was refused. This experience shaped Washington's view of British authority. He was loyal to the crown, deeply so, but he resented the casual contempt with which colonial officers were treated. He was developing a nascent sense that Americans, while British subjects, were not quite equal to Englishmen born in England. These feelings would simmer for years before exploding into revolution. In 1758, the British tried again to capture Fort Duquesne. This time, they sent Brigadier General John Forbes with a much larger force. Washington and the Virginia Regiment were part of the expedition. Forbes was more cautious than Braddock. He moved slowly, building supply depots and fortifications as he advanced. Washington chafed at the slow pace. He wanted glory, action, decisive victory. But Forbes's caution paid off. By the time the British Army approached Fort Duquesne in November 1758, the French had abandoned it. They burned the fort and withdrew, recognizing they could not hold it against such a large force. Washington and his men marched into the smoking ruins. It was not the dramatic victory he had dreamed of, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Ohio Valley was now under British control. The immediate threat to Virginia's frontier was over. George Washington resigned his commission in December 1758. He had served for 5 years. He had learned the rudiments of military command. He had earned a reputation for bravery and persistence. But he had also grown weary of the thanklessness of military service. He was 26 years old. He had achieved a measure of fame, but he had not achieved wealth or the social status he craved. It was time to try a different path. It was time to become a gentleman planter and to find a wife. On January 6, 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis in a quiet ceremony at her estate, the White House plantation on the Pamunkey River. Martha was a widow. Her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died suddenly 2 years earlier, leaving her with 2 young children, Jackie, age 4, and Patsy, age 2, and an enormous fortune. She was one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. She was also intelligent, capable, and practical. She had managed her late husband's complicated estate through difficult legal challenges. She was not a fragile aristocrat. She was a partner. What drew George and Martha together? It was not a grand romantic passion, at least. Washington's letters do not suggest one. But there was genuine affection, mutual respect, and compatibility. Martha was warm where George was reserved. She was socially skilled, able to put guests at ease. She provided the domestic stability that Washington craved. And, practically speaking, the marriage transformed Washington's financial situation. Martha's wealth, her land, her slaves. Her investments made Washington one of the richest men in Virginia. He could now afford to live like the gentleman he had always wanted to be. He also became stepfather to Jackie and Patsy. He had no biological children of his own, likely due to infertility from a childhood illness. But he cared for Martha's children as if they were his. He doted especially on Patsy, a sweet-natured girl who suffered from epilepsy. Her eventual death would devastate him. George and Martha settled into life at Mount Vernon. For the next 15 years, George Washington devoted himself to becoming a model Virginia planter. He expanded Mount Vernon from a modest farmhouse into an elegant mansion. He added wings, redesigned the interior, furnished it with imported goods. He landscaped the grounds, planting gardens, creating vistas. Mount Vernon became a showplace, a physical embodiment of Washington's status and taste. He managed his plantation with meticulous attention to detail. He kept exhaustive records, crop yields, weather conditions, the work assignments of every enslaved person on the estate. He experimented with new crops, trying to move away from tobacco toward wheat, which was less damaging to the soil and less dependent on British markets. He was a hands-on manager, rising early, riding out to inspect his fields, supervising construction projects. He designed a 16-sided barn for treading wheat, an innovative structure that reflected his fascination with efficiency and improvement. But Mount Vernon's prosperity, like that of all Virginia plantations, rested on the forced labor of enslaved people. By the time of the Revolution, George Washington enslaved more than 300 human beings. They planted his crops, built his buildings, cooked his food, cleaned his house, cared for his horses. They made his life of genteel leisure possible. Without their labor, Mount Vernon could not exist. Washington's views on slavery evolved slowly over his lifetime, but they began from a place of complete acceptance. As a young man, he bought and sold enslaved people as casually as he bought and sold livestock. He placed advertisements for runaway slaves, offering rewards for their capture. When one young man named Tom ran away repeatedly, Washington had him sold to the West Indies, a punishment tantamount to a death sentence, given the brutal conditions there. Yet Washington was not, by the standards of his time and place, considered a particularly cruel enslaver. He generally opposed the physical punishment of enslaved people, though he did not forbid it. He provided basic food, clothing, and shelter. He kept families together when possible. But these were the bare minimum gestures of decency within an inherently inhumane system. After the Revolution, after fighting for liberty and equality, Washington began to feel the moral weight of the contradiction. He privately expressed discomfort with slavery. He stopped buying new slaves. In his will, he made provision for the gradual emancipation of the people he enslaved, though only after Martha's death. But during his lifetime, he freed only one enslaved person, William Lee, his personal valet, who served him faithfully throughout the Revolutionary War. Washington's failure to take stronger action against slavery during his life remains the greatest moral stain on his legacy. He had the power, the prestige, and the moral authority to speak out. He chose not to, for reasons of economic self-interest, social pressure, and personal comfort. It is a failure that cannot be explained away or excused. It can only be acknowledged, understood in context, and remembered as a reminder that even great figures are capable of profound moral blindness. While Washington played the role of country squire, political tensions between Britain and its American colonies were rising. The French and Indian War had been expensive. Britain was deep in debt. The British government believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense. Between 1764 and 1774, Parliament passed a series of taxes and regulations: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. The Tea Act. The colonists objected not just to the taxes themselves, but to the principle. They had no representatives in Parliament. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. If Parliament could tax them without their consent, what other powers might it claim? George Washington followed these developments with growing alarm. He was not a radical. He did not read political philosophy. He was not interested in abstract debates about natural rights or the social contract. But he was a practical man, and he could see that British policies were unjust and economically harmful. In 1769, Washington drafted a set of resolutions calling for Virginia to boycott British goods until the taxes were repealed. He presented them to the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial legislature, of which he was a member. The resolutions passed. Washington was not yet calling for independence, few were, but he was taking a stand. Washington had entered politics in 1758, when he was elected to the House of Burgesses representing Frederick County. Later, he represented Fairfax County, closer to Mount Vernon. He was not a great legislator. He rarely spoke in debates. He was awkward with words, more comfortable with actions than arguments. But he was respected. He attended sessions faithfully. He served on committees. He was known as a man of integrity, someone whose word could be trusted. As the 1770s progressed, the conflict with Britain intensified. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In Boston, protesters disguised as Mohawk warriors dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was an act of defiance that thrilled radicals and horrified moderates. The British government responded with the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and imposed direct military rule. The message was clear: submit or be crushed. Virginia, hundreds of miles from Boston, could have stayed out of it. But Virginians saw the attack on Massachusetts as a threat to all the colonies. If Parliament could strip one colony of its rights, it could strip them all. In August 1774, Washington was elected as one of Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress, a gathering of representatives from 12 colonies. Georgia did not send delegates to coordinate a response to British actions. Washington rode north to Philadelphia. He was 42 years old. He had been a soldier, a planter, a legislator. Now he was about to become a revolutionary. Philadelphia in 1774 was the largest city in British North America, a bustling port of about 30,000 people. It was cosmopolitan, prosperous, and deeply divided over how to respond to the British crisis. The First Continental Congress convened in Carpenter's Hall in September 1774. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered to debate their course of action. Some, like Samuel Adams and John Adams from Massachusetts, were radicals who believed the colonies must resist Britain by force if necessary. Others, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, hoped for reconciliation. George Washington was neither the most radical nor the most conservative. He listened more than he spoke, but his physical presence made an impression. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, towering over most men of the era. He carried himself with military bearing, and uniquely among the delegates. He attended the sessions in his old military uniform from the French and Indian War. It was a statement, a reminder. Washington was signaling that he was prepared to fight if it came to that. The Congress debated for weeks. They drafted a Declaration of Rights. They agreed to a coordinated boycott of British goods. They sent a petition to King George III, respectfully but firmly asserting their grievances. And they agreed to meet again the following May if Britain did not address their concerns. Then the delegates went home, hoping for peace but preparing for war. Back in Virginia, Washington threw himself into military preparations. He helped organize and train the Fairfax County militia. He studied military texts, refreshing his knowledge of strategy and tactics. He corresponded with other patriots about military supplies, about organizing resistance. Martha watched with worry. She knew that if war came, George would be in the thick of it. He could not help himself. His sense of honor, his ambition, his deep belief in the cause, all of it pulled him toward the fight. In April 1775. The news everyone had been dreading arrived. British troops had marched out of Boston to seize colonial military supplies stored in Concord, Massachusetts. At Lexington Green, they encountered a company of local militia farmers and tradesmen armed with muskets. Someone fired a shot. No one knows who. The British regulars returned fire. 8 militiamen died. The British continued to Concord, where they destroyed some supplies before being forced to retreat by swarms of colonial militia. The retreat became a running battle. The militiamen fired from behind trees, stone walls, buildings using the same tactics Native Americans had used against Braddock. By the time the British straggled back into Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. The American Revolution had begun. In May 1775. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. The mood was urgent, almost frantic. War had started. Thousands of militiamen were converging on Boston, besieging the British garrison there. But there was no unified command, no strategy, no real army, just a mob of armed farmers. The Congress faced an immediate question: who should command the colonial forces? The obvious candidate was Artemas Ward, a Massachusetts general already on the scene. But choosing a New Englander would make the war seem like a regional conflict. If the colonies were to unite against Britain, they needed a commander who represented all of them. They needed someone from the South, preferably Virginia, the largest and most powerful colony. They needed someone with military experience, someone respected, someone who looked like a leader. John Adams stood and nominated George Washington. It was a brilliant political move. Washington was a Virginian, which would tie the South to the New England cause. He had military experience. He was wealthy, which suggested he could not be easily bribed. And perhaps most importantly, he was not a politician. He had no faction, no political debts. He could be trusted. Washington himself was in the room when Adams made the nomination. According to one witness, Washington's face flushed with embarrassment. He quickly left the chamber. The next day, June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress unanimously elected George Washington as general and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepted with a short speech. He refused any salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. He expressed doubt about his own abilities. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he said. It was not false modesty. Washington genuinely feared he was not up to the task. He had never commanded more than a regiment. He had never fought a major battle. He had no experience with siege warfare, with logistics on this scale, with managing the fragile politics of 13 fractious colonies, but he would do his duty. He always did. Washington left Philadelphia on June 23, 1775, riding north with a small escort. He was dressed in a new uniform, blue and buff, the colors that would become iconic. He wore a sword at his side. Along the road, people gathered to see the new commander. They cheered. They called out blessings. Washington must have felt the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders. He reached the outskirts of Boston on July 2, 1775. What he found there shocked him. The army besieging Boston was a chaotic mass of militia units from different colonies. There were no uniforms, no standardized weapons, no organization above the regiment level. Sanitation was appalling. Discipline was non-existent. Soldiers came and went as they pleased. Officers were elected by their men and hesitated to give unpopular orders. He set to work immediately, imposing order. He established a chain of command. He demanded regular roll calls. He court-martialed officers who neglected their duties. He enforced standards of hygiene. He begged Congress for supplies, for gunpowder, for muskets. His officers were a mixed lot. Some, like Nathanael Greene, a former Quaker from Rhode Island with no military experience, would prove brilliant. Others were incompetent, cowardly, or insubordinate. Washington had to navigate not just military challenges, but political ones. Every state was jealous of its prerogatives. Militia units resented taking orders from officers from other colonies. Congress had no power to tax, so money was always short. Soldiers enlisted for short terms, often just a few months, and then went home, forcing Washington to constantly rebuild his army. And looming over everything was the fact that they were fighting the British Army, the most powerful military force in the world. Before Washington's arrival, the militia besieging Boston had fought one major battle on June 17, 1775. Colonial forces occupied Breed's Hill, often misremembered as Bunker Hill, overlooking Boston. The British, under General William Howe, launched a frontal assault to dislodge them. The militiamen, dug in behind earthworks, waited until the British regulars were almost upon them before firing. The volleys were devastating. The British attack collapsed. They reformed and attacked again. Again they were driven back on the third assault. The colonials ran out of ammunition and were forced to retreat. The British took the hill, but at a terrible price, over 1,000 casualties, including many officers. The battle proved that American militia could stand against British regulars if they had cover and defensive positions. But it also showed their limitations. They had no bayonets, no artillery, no ability to fight in the open. Washington studied the lessons of Bunker Hill carefully. He would spend the next 8 years trying to build an army that could do more than just defend earthworks. Through the summer and fall of 1775, the siege dragged on. Washington's army surrounded Boston, but they lacked the artillery to drive the British out. The British had control of the city and the harbor, but they were trapped, unable to break out. Washington drilled his men. He wrote endless letters to Congress, to the state governors, begging for supplies. He dealt with petty jealousies, with desertions, with soldiers who refused to serve under officers from other colonies. He also had to make a crucial decision: how to treat this conflict. Was this a rebellion, a civil war, or a legitimate fight for independence? In the fall of 1775, most Americans, including Washington, still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They saw themselves as loyal subjects petitioning for their rights. But King George III refused to even receive their petitions. In August 1775, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. The path to independence was becoming clearer. In January 1776, Washington finally got the break he needed. Henry Knox, a young bookseller turned artillery officer, completed an extraordinary feat. He had traveled to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, captured by colonial forces the previous May, and transported 60 tons of artillery, cannons, mortars, and other heavy guns over 300 miles of snow-covered wilderness in the dead of winter. It took 2 months. Knox and his men dragged the guns on sleds pulled by oxen over frozen rivers, through mountain passes, through blizzards. It was a logistical miracle. When the guns arrived in Cambridge, Washington immediately put them to use. On the night of March 4, 1776, Washington's men moved the artillery onto Dorchester Heights, a high point overlooking Boston Harbor. They worked in silence, constructing fortifications under cover of darkness. When the British woke the next morning, they saw cannons pointed down at them. General Howe, the British commander, faced an impossible situation. If Washington opened fire, the entire British position would become untenable. Howe considered an assault on Dorchester Heights, but after the bloodbath at Bunker Hill, he could not stomach the potential losses. Instead, he chose to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, the British Army and more than 1,000 Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed out of Boston Harbor. They withdrew to Halifax, Nova Scotia, leaving Boston in American hands. It was a bloodless victory, a strategic triumph. Washington had forced the British out of the city without a major battle. Congress awarded him a gold medal. Newspapers hailed him as a hero, but Washington knew the war was just beginning. The British would return with a larger force, and next time they would not be so easily dislodged. He ordered his army to march south to New York City because that, he was certain, was where the British would strike next. George Washington arrived in New York City in April 1776 and immediately recognized the strategic nightmare he faced. New York was located on a series of islands: Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, surrounded by rivers that British warships could navigate easily. The city had no natural defenses. The surrounding terrain, hills, forests, marshes, favored attackers, and Washington's army, numbering about 19,000 men, was still a poorly trained, poorly equipped collection of militias. Defending New York was probably impossible, but politically he had no choice. Congress wanted the city held. New York was a vital port, a commercial center. Abandoning it without a fight would devastate morale. So Washington did his best. He divided his forces between Manhattan and Long Island. He constructed fortifications. He drilled his troops. And he waited. While he waited, the world changed. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, was a radical statement. It declared that the colonies were now independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. It asserted that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was beautiful, soaring rhetoric. It was also a declaration of war to the finish. There would be no reconciliation now. This was revolution. When Washington received the news, he had the declaration read aloud to his troops. The soldiers cheered. That night, a mob of patriots tore down a statue of King George III and melted it down to make musket balls. Washington was pleased by his men's enthusiasm, but he was also sobering. The time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be freemen or slaves, he wrote. He knew what was coming. In late June and early July, the British fleet began arriving off New York. Ship after ship appeared on the horizon. By mid-August, more than 400 vessels crowded the harbor, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. Aboard were 32,000 professional soldiers, including 8,000 Hessian mercenaries from Germany. Washington watched from the shore and felt dread settle over him. His army was outnumbered, outgunned, and outtrained. The British commander, General William Howe, was a skilled and cautious officer. Howe's brother, Admiral Richard Howe, commanded the fleet. The Americans were about to face the full might of the British Empire. The British struck at Long Island. Under cover of darkness, they landed 15,000 troops and marched around the American left flank, using a lightly defended pass to get behind Washington's forward positions. When dawn broke, the Americans found themselves trapped. The British attacked from 3 directions. The American lines collapsed. Soldiers fled in panic. Hundreds were killed or captured. Washington, watching from across the East River, was helpless. By the end of the day, his entire force on Long Island, about 9,000 men, was pinned against the river. Surrounded on 3 sides by a superior enemy. It should have been the end of the Revolution. Howe could have pressed the attack, crushed the American army, captured or killed Washington. Instead, he hesitated. Perhaps he remembered Bunker Hill. Perhaps he still hoped the rebels would negotiate once they realized the hopelessness of their situation. That hesitation gave Washington one chance. On the night of August 29th, Washington ordered a retreat across the East River to Manhattan. It was an incredibly risky operation, moving 9,000 men plus equipment and supplies across a mile-wide river at night under the noses of the enemy required perfect coordination. Any delay, any mistake, and the entire army would be captured. Washington personally supervised the evacuation. He stood on the shore, directing the boats, keeping the men calm. He stayed until the very last boat pushed off, just as dawn was breaking. A thick fog rolled in one of those strange coincidences. That felt like divine intervention shielding the retreat from British observation. By the time the fog lifted and the British realized what had happened, the entire American army had vanished. Washington had pulled off a miraculous escape. But the situation remained desperate. Over the following weeks, the British tightened their grip. They landed on Manhattan. Washington's army retreated north, fighting a series of small, confused battles. Kip's Bay, Harlem Heights. Morale was collapsing. Desertions were rampant. In October, the British outflanked Washington again, forcing him to retreat from Manhattan into Westchester County. At the Battle of White Plains, the Americans held briefly before retreating again. Washington made a terrible mistake. He left a garrison of about 3,000 men in Fort Washington, a fortification on the northern tip of Manhattan. He believed it could be held. On November 16, 1776, the British stormed Fort Washington. The Americans surrendered after a brief fight. Nearly 3,000 soldiers were captured, the largest loss of American troops in a single action. During the entire war, Washington, watching from the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, reportedly wept. With winter approaching, Washington's army retreated across New Jersey, chased by British and Hessian forces. It was a nightmare march. The men were exhausted, hungry, poorly clothed. Many had no shoes. They left bloody footprints in the snow. Soldiers deserted every night, slipping away to return to their farms and families. Officers resigned their commissions. The army shrank from 19,000 to fewer than 3,000 men. Thomas Paine, the radical pamphleteer, was with the army during the retreat. He watched the suffering and began writing by campfire light. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Paine's essay. The American Crisis was published in December 1776. Washington had it read aloud to his troops. It gave them something they desperately needed, hope, but hope alone could not win a war. By early December, Washington's army had retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. He ordered every boat for miles up and down the river to be seized or destroyed, preventing the British from pursuing immediately. The British, satisfied that the rebellion was collapsing, went into winter quarters. General Howe returned to New York. He left Hessian garrisons at Trenton and other towns in New Jersey to hold the territory. The Hessians, professional soldiers from German states who rented their services to Britain, were effective but arrogant. They treated the New Jersey civilians harshly, seizing supplies, quartering troops in homes, earning the hatred of the local population. Washington camped across the river with his tiny, freezing army, knew he had to do something dramatic. Most of his men's enlistments expired on December 31st. If he did not act, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. He decided to attack. The plan was audacious. Washington would take his entire force, about 2,400 men, across the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles to Trenton, and attack the Hessian garrison at dawn. Everything had to go perfectly. If the Hessians received any warning, if the river proved impassable, if the men could not make the march, the entire army would be destroyed. On Christmas evening, December 25, 1776, the troops assembled on the Pennsylvania shore. It was snowing. The river was clogged with ice. The men were nervous, exhausted, doubtful. Washington moved among them, calm and confident. The crossing began at dusk. Large boats, Durham boats, designed for hauling freight, ferried the men across. The crossing took longer than planned. Ice battered the boats. Men slipped and fell. Horses panicked. Washington had hoped to attack before dawn. By the time everyone was across, it was nearly 4 a.m. Dawn was just hours away. They had no choice but to continue. The army marched through the darkness, through snow and sleet. Washington rode up and down the column, keeping the men moving. At one point, he noticed an officer writing something. "What are you writing?" Washington asked. "Just noting the date for my journal, sir," the officer replied. Washington smiled grimly. "Put down that the time is near when every man must think of his own life." They reached Trenton just after dawn. The Hessians, recovering from Christmas celebrations, were caught completely by surprise. The American forces attacked from two directions, artillery blasting down the streets. The Hessians scrambled to form ranks, but they were confused, disoriented. Their commander, Colonel Johann Roll, was shot and mortally wounded. Within an hour, it was over. Nearly 900 Hessians surrendered. American casualties were minimal. 2 men froze to death on the march. But none were killed in the battle itself. Washington had pulled off a stunning victory. News of Trenton electrified the country. Newspapers that had been printing obituaries for the Revolution now celebrated Washington as a hero. Congress, which had been preparing to flee Philadelphia, stayed put. Enlistments, which had been collapsing, began to recover. But Washington knew one victory was not enough. He needed to keep the momentum. On January 3, 1777, Washington fought and won another small battle at Princeton. Using clever maneuvers to outflank a British force and drive them from the town, then, with British reinforcements approaching, Washington withdrew his army to winter quarters in the hills of northern New Jersey. The winter of 1776 to 1777 had begun in despair. It ended with hope. Washington had shown that the Continental Army could fight, could win, could survive. The Revolution was still alive, but the hardest trials were still ahead. In the spring of 1777, General William Howe launched a new campaign. His objective: capture Philadelphia, the American capital and the seat of the Continental Congress. Howe's strategy was methodical. He loaded 15,000 troops onto ships in New York, sailed south, and landed at the head of Chesapeake Bay in late August. From there, he marched north toward Philadelphia. Washington moved to intercept him. The two armies collided at Brandywine Creek in southeastern Pennsylvania. Washington positioned his forces along the creek, hoping to block Howe's advance, but once again, Howe outmaneuvered him. The British commander sent a flanking force on a long march round the American right, just as he had at Long Island. By the time Washington realized what was happening, it was too late. The Americans fought hard, but they were outflanked and forced to retreat. Casualties were heavy: about 1,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured. Washington had been outgeneraled again. On September 26, 1777, British troops marched into Philadelphia unopposed. Congress had fled to York, Pennsylvania. Howe took up residence in the finest house in the city. Losing the capital was a blow to American morale, but it was not militarily decisive. Congress continued to function from York. The Revolution did not depend on holding cities. It depended on keeping the army in the field. Still, Washington felt the weight of failure. He had not been able to protect Philadelphia. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. He resolved to attack. Washington devised a complex plan. His army would attack the British garrison at Germantown, just outside Philadelphia, in 4 separate columns converging simultaneously at dawn. It was an ambitious, sophisticated maneuver, perhaps too ambitious for his inexperienced army. The attack began well. American forces surprised the British and drove them back. But then things went wrong. A thick fog rolled in. Units lost contact with each other. American soldiers, hearing gunfire from unexpected directions, began firing at each other in the confusion. One division ran out of ammunition. Another got lost. The British rallied and counterattacked. The Americans were forced to retreat, having suffered another costly defeat. Washington was devastated. He had come so close. If only the fog had not rolled in. If only the coordination had been better. But in the end, another defeat was still a defeat, while Washington struggled in Pennsylvania. Events in upstate New York were unfolding. That would change the course of the war. A British army under General John Burgoyne had marched south from Canada, intending to seize control of the Hudson River and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. But American forces under General Horatio Gates surrounded Burgoyne at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. It was the most significant American victory of the war so far, and it had profound consequences. France, which had been covertly supplying the Americans with weapons and money, now saw that the rebels had a real chance of winning. In February 1778, France formally allied with the United States, committing its army and navy to the fight against Britain. The American Revolution had become a global war. As winter approached, Washington had to find a place for his army to rest and regroup. He chose Valley Forge, a plateau about 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. It was a defensible position, close enough to watch the British, but far enough away to be safe from a surprise attack. There was wood for fires, water from nearby streams, but there was almost nothing else. What followed would become the most famous winter in American history, a byword for suffering. The Continental Army that staggered into Valley Forge in December 1777 numbered about 12,000 men. Within weeks, those men were living in hell. There were no barracks, so the soldiers built crude log huts, cramped, drafty, smoky shelters that provided minimal protection from the cold. 12 men crowded into huts designed for 8. There was no straw for bedding, so men slept on the frozen ground. Food was scarce. The army supply system had collapsed. Farmers in the surrounding countryside were reluctant to sell provisions for continental currency, which was nearly worthless when the British in Philadelphia would pay in gold. Some days, the soldiers received a handful of flour and nothing else. On many days, they received nothing at all. Clothing was even worse. Many men had no coats. Thousands had no shoes or boots. They wrapped their feet in rags. Washington reported that at one point, nearly 4,000 men were unfit for duty because they were barefoot and otherwise naked. Disease swept through the camp: typhus, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. Men huddled in their huts, shivering with fever, too weak to move. The camp hospital was overwhelmed. Hundreds died. Washington walked through the camp every day, witnessing the suffering. He wrote desperate letters to Congress, to the state governors, begging for supplies. Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, he wrote, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. But the army did not starve, dissolve, or disperse. Somehow, it held together. Why? Part of the answer lies in Washington himself. He refused to take quarters in a comfortable house while his men suffered. He stayed in the camp, living in a tent until his officers insisted he move into a small stone farmhouse. That served as his headquarters. Even then, he shared the deprivation. He ate the same rations, endured the same cold. The soldiers saw this. They saw that their commander was with them, suffering alongside them. Washington also maintained discipline. Men were court-martialed for theft, for desertion, for insubordination. Punishments were harsh floggings, sometimes executions. But the discipline held the army together, gave it structure and purpose. And slowly, conditions began to improve. In February 1778, a Prussian officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. Steuben claimed to be a baron and a former general in the Prussian army. In truth, he was neither. He exaggerated his credentials to impress the Americans. But he was a skilled military professional, and he had something the Continental Army desperately needed: knowledge of European military drill and tactics. Washington appointed Steuben inspector general and gave him the task of training the army. Steuben threw himself into the work. He personally drilled a model company, teaching them how to march in formation, how to load and fire muskets quickly, how to execute bayonet charges. Then those men trained others, spreading the knowledge through the camp. Steuben spoke no English, so he bellowed commands in French and German while his aides translated. When the soldiers made mistakes, he cursed them fluently in multiple languages, then burst out laughing. The men loved him. By spring, the Continental Army had been transformed. It was still small, still poorly supplied, but it was now a disciplined, professional fighting force. Washington had not just survived Valley Forge. He had used it to forge a real army. One small but significant detail: Martha Washington came to Valley Forge every winter of the war. Martha traveled from Mount Vernon to wherever her husband's headquarters were located. She stayed for months at a time, living in the camp, sharing his hardships. At Valley Forge, she organized the officers' wives to sew shirts, roll bandages, and care for the sick. She visited the hospitals, bringing what comfort she could. Her presence was a morale boost for the soldiers, a reminder of home and normalcy. Washington adored her. In letters, he was usually formal and restrained, but when he wrote to Martha, warmth seeped through. She was his refuge, his constant support. In May 1778, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge. The soldiers were leaner, harder, more confident. They had survived, and now they were ready to fight. On June 18, 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia and marched back toward New York. Fearing a French attack on the city now that France had entered the war, Washington pursued. On June 28th, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. It was a brutal, confusing fight in sweltering heat. At one point, an American general, Charles Lee, ordered a retreat without authorization, nearly causing a disaster. Washington galloped onto the field, saw the chaos, and exploded in rage. He personally rallied the retreating troops, cursing Lee with such ferocity that witnesses were shocked. Washington almost never lost his temper in public, but when he did, it was volcanic. The American line stabilized. The battle ended in a draw, but strategically it was an American success. Washington had shown that his army could stand toe-to-toe with the British in open combat. The war was entering a new phase after Monmouth. The war in the northern states settled into a frustrating stalemate. The British held New York City, a massive fortified base. Washington's army camped in the surrounding countryside, watching, waiting, occasionally skirmishing, but unable to launch a decisive attack. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides needed time to rebuild. For Washington, these were years of constant frustration. His army was always undermanned, always undersupplied. Congress lacked the power to tax, so it could not reliably fund the war. Soldiers went unpaid for months, sometimes years. Mutinies broke out among Pennsylvania and New Jersey troops. Though Washington managed to suppress them without mass executions, he dealt with petty politics, with jealous officers, with states that refused to send reinforcements. He wrote thousands of letters begging, cajoling, demanding. It was not glorious. It was administrative drudgery, punctuated by moments of terror. Unable to break the stalemate in the North, the British shifted their focus south. They believed that the southern colonies, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, had large loyalist populations that would rise up to support the crown if given the chance. They believed the South could be conquered and held, cutting the Revolution in half. In late 1778, the British captured Savannah, Georgia. In May 1780, they captured Charleston, South Carolina. Along with 5,000 American troops, the worst American defeat of the entire war. Washington was hundreds of miles away, helpless to intervene. He sent his best general, Nathanael Greene, to take command of the Southern Army and do what he could. Greene fought a brilliant campaign, avoiding major battles, wearing the British down through maneuver and attrition. But by 1781, the British under Lord Cornwallis controlled much of the South. The war seemed to be tipping in Britain's favor. In September 1780, Washington suffered a devastating personal betrayal. Benedict Arnold, one of his most talented and aggressive generals, had turned traitor. Arnold had fought bravely in numerous battles. He had been wounded multiple times, But he felt unappreciated, passed over for promotion, criticized for minor infractions. He was also in debt and living beyond his means, motivated by resentment and greed. Arnold secretly negotiated with the British. He agreed to surrender West Point, a crucial American fortress on the Hudson River, in exchange for money and a British commission. The plot was discovered almost by accident when a British liaison officer, Major John Andre, was captured carrying incriminating documents. Arnold escaped to a British ship. Andre was hanged as a spy. Washington was shaken. He had trusted Arnold, relied on him. The betrayal cut deep. Arnold's treason became a symbol proof that even heroes could fall, that the cause required constant vigilance. France's entry into the war brought hope, but also frustration. The French sent a fleet and an army, but coordinating operations between American and French forces was difficult. Language barriers, cultural differences, and clashing strategic priorities created friction. Several joint operations failed. An attempted siege of Savannah in 1779 ended in a bloody repulse. A planned attack on New York in 1780 was called off. But the French provided something essential, a credible naval threat. The British now had to worry about French warships challenging their control of the seas. That changed the strategic calculus. By the summer of 1781, the situation looked bleak for the Americans. The war was in its 6th year. Soldiers were exhausted. Civilians were weary. The economy was in shambles. Continental currency was worthless. Congress was nearly bankrupt. Washington's army, camped outside New York, numbered fewer than 10,000 men. The British garrison in the city was about the same size, but better supplied. Washington desperately wanted to attack New York, to strike a decisive blow. But he lacked the strength then, in August. Everything changed. The Comte de Rochambeau, commander of the French army in America, received a message from Admiral de Grasse, commander of the French West Indies fleet. De Grasse was sailing north with his entire fleet, 28 ships of the line, the most powerful naval force in American waters. He would be available for joint operations for a limited time, just a few weeks in late summer, before he had to return south. But there was a catch. De Grasse was sailing not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. Rochambeau met with Washington. Together,